Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. So I just got in the mail a MIG Switch dumper as well as the MIG Switch tool. Now I actually bought these myself and they've changed the name on these. So they no longer want to use the word Switch. Apparently Nintendo doesn't like that. So they're calling these now MIG Flash. And so I want to do a quick review of each of these and just see how it's going to work from a user perspective. Now I've already done one video about the original MIG Switch. So this is the version 2. It has a button on top. And so there have been some physical hardware improvements to it. But the other big factor here is that I now have the dumper, which I haven't had before, and I think that the combination of these two can go in some really interesting directions. And what I really want to focus on in this video is just my own hypothetical example of why I can see myself using the MIG Flash tool, especially now that I have that dumper, because I want to use it as a backup system for my own ROM files. And I mentioned it in the last video, but I have collected Nintendo Switch cartridges over the life cycle of this device, and so I have almost 100 games at this point. And if you factor in that each of these cost, somewhere around $30 each, because I mostly focus on the lightweight games, we're talking about $3,000 of an investment for all these cartridges. And so I do really like the idea of being able to back up all of my cartridges and then also putting them on a separate cartridge that I can just use as a one and done. And so in this video, I want to walk you through just how it's been for me in owning both of these tools and whether or not it would be a good fit for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start by taking a look at each of these tools. We'll start with the cartridge itself first. Now, like I mentioned, they've changed the name. It's now going to be called MIG Flash, but it's basically going to be a Nintendo Switch cartridge that has an SD card slot inside. But the big change with version 2 is that we now have this little button on the side. Now, the hardware itself of this button is not great. You have to basically push it just perfectly in order for the button to press down. And there's definitely a part of me that's worried about this build quality and that the button might break over time. And so I've been really babying it over the past few days of testing it out. So far, I haven't had any issues with the physical hardware itself, but I do feel like this is a weak point so far. Now, the way this works is once you load up your games, you'll put it inside and then you'll slot this into your Nintendo Switch. And then if you want to change games, you're just going to press the button and it'll cycle through whatever games are installed on your card. And this is definitely an improvement over the previous model where you had to actually eject it and then reinsert it in perfect timing in order for it to change the game. And so I do think that this button is going to create less wear and tear on your machine and the cartridge slot. Now, as I'll show off when we actually test this cartridge, there's still no rhyme or reason when it comes to actually loading up your games. As far as I can tell, the games are going to be loaded by title ID, and so it's just going to be kind of random. And what you'll do is you'll press the button once to cycle to the next game, or you can press and hold to go back to the previous game. But as you can imagine, if you've got like 100 games on your cartridge, that can be quite a pain to cycle through each of them. But I do have a couple ideas about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. For now, let's actually move on and talk about the dumper next. Now, this dumper is really interesting, and I've been most excited to get my hands on this because it is, in effect, just a cartridge dumper. So you'll put your Nintendo Switch cartridge inside, and then on the opposite side, we have a USB-C port, so you'll connect it to your computer, and then it is essentially drag and drop to move your games over to your computer from there. And initially, I was kind of worried about this entire setup. I thought that it would require some sort of special software installed on my computer, but no, it is literally plug and play. They've already preloaded it with whatever firmware is required, and you can just plug this in and then drag and drop. And so no extra software required. So that's been a big bonus for me. Now, it is possible to dump Nintendo Switch cartridges without this dumper, but it will require a modded Nintendo Switch. And if you've got a modded Nintendo Switch, you don't really need a dumper because you can just run games off an SD card. And so I found that this is probably the most valuable thing in the entire package. Speaking of value, let's talk about the price. So this is $65 for the Flash cartridge itself, and then $70 for the dumper. And you can also get them combined as a bundle pack from the company itself for, I think, $125. And that's exactly what I did. I just bought a bundle pack, and it took me about 3 or 4 months of waiting until it actually arrived. Now, as I mentioned previously, I have a ton of Nintendo Switch cartridges. I usually will just keep a lookout on Best Buy and Amazon and try to find the best sales. And I have about 80 in this case right here, and about 20 others that we have as well. And so I own about 100 cartridges, which I think is overkill, but part of this is just kind of the investment into a gaming machine that my kids will be able to enjoy in the years to come. I kind of think about it like when I had a Nintendo and a Genesis back in the day. We kept a couple of those games over the years, but for the most part, we would trade them with other people. And I think at some point, one of my siblings may have sold some of them off. As it stands, I've got a few of my childhood games, but not that many. I had to rebuy many of them for a lot more than we paid for them back in the day. And so that's one of the reasons why I've been investing in these Nintendo Switch cartridges, basically everything that I think that I want to play now and may want to play in the future. Because I think that even though we don't really know what the Switch 2 is going to be like, this might be one of the last consoles ever that has a collectible game system. And the idea of being able to back up each of these cartridges for my own just personal backup, but then also to be able to emulate with those games as well, is really kind of icing on the cake. And so I personally think that $125 was well worth it to be able to dump all of my games, but then also to be able to replay them as well. And so I really don't want to look at this from a piracy perspective. The idea that you could maybe take a cartridge, maybe for rent or whatever, then back it up and use it elsewhere. I don't like any of that stuff. I like the idea of being able to back up my own games. And I also just really like the convenience factor of having this cartridge to be able to throw all the games onto here and then not have to worry about losing a cartridge, because these things are pretty small and I've got some pretty young kids. So let's go ahead and walk through this entire setup process, and we're going to do it very hands-on. So I've got my tablet PC right here, I've got my cartridges, I've got my MIG stuff, and then I've got a Nintendo Switch OLED that we'll test on. So the first thing about the dumper is that it does not come with a USB-C cable, so you need to bring your own. And I would recommend getting a pretty good one that has a high transfer speed. I've got a nice U-green cable that I'm going to use for this project, but anything you have lying around should work pretty well. So first things first, let's go ahead and plug in the dumper, and then I'm going to plug the other end into the computer itself. And just like that, you can see that a window will just pop open, and it's going to be just an empty drive at this point. Now I'm going to grab just a random card, so let's go with Disco Elysium. So I have this one right here. And so from there, I'm just going to plug this in directly into the cartridge. It has to go in upside down. And as soon as that happens, the window will disappear and then reappear with the name of the file. And if we go ahead and go inside of the folder, you can see that, yeah, we've got the ROM file itself right here. And then we've got a bunch of other system files. These are going to be identifier files to identify the cartridge. And some of these are going to be unique to the specific cartridge that we're using here in this example. And so you would not want to share these files with somebody else, because if they go online with their Nintendo Switch with these files and you do the same, then there's a possibility that one or both of you will have your accounts banned. And so you definitely don't want to do that. And so instead, we're just using this for backup purposes. Okay, so now let's say that you just want to take this game and you want to dump it onto your computer and then load it up onto an SD card so you can use it with that MIG Flash cart. And so that's going to be the next step in our process. So I've got a 1 terabyte micro SD card, and then I also have a micro SD card to SD adapter. So here, all I'm going to do is just slot them into place, and then I'm going to put the SD card inside the side here of my PC. And once I inserted the card, you can see that a window popped up, and there's a bunch of different games here. And that's because I was already testing with this previously. So I have 4 games already loaded on here, but none of them are Disco Elysium. You can see that each of them are a folder with the XCI extension to them. And same thing here, if I go into any of these folders, you can see we have the ROM and then all of those other files. So on the left side here, I have my Disco Elysium cartridge from the dumper. And then on the right side, I have my SD card files. So what I'm going to do here is just drag and drop this folder over. Now, depending on the size of your card, as well as the speed of the cable, as well as your connection to the computer, this might take several minutes. I've found on average, it takes somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes per cartridge. And it will depend on the size of the game. So if it's a really lightweight game that's only like a couple hundred megabytes, it'll take just a matter of a minute or two. But if it's a full-on game, like Disco Elysium, I think it's like 7 gigabytes, this one's a big one. So it is going to take quite some time. But as you can see here, it's estimating somewhere between like 6 and 8 minutes, and that seems about right. So we'll come back once this is finished and we'll go on to the next step. Also bear in mind that we're going directly from a cartridge to a micro SD card, and so there's a lot of transferring happening in Windows. Not only are we limited by the cable itself and the USB connection, but then also the reader speed as well as your card speed. And so there are quite a few variables in play. If you wanted an even faster experience, you could just drag it directly over to computer, which we'll do here in a minute. Okay, so here we are. We've moved over Disco Elysium. It took about 8 minutes altogether. And so now I'm going to move it over just to the computer just to see how fast that's going to be by comparison. So this time I'm just going to drag and drop it over to the downloads folder and see what happens. So looking at just the transfer speeds right here, it's an average of about 20 megabytes per second. So I'm expecting this to be about 5.5 minutes compared to 8 minutes when going to the SD card. And so this has kind of been my goal and my approach, is that I'm going to dump all of my cartridges onto my computer and then put them like on an external drive. And then when I want to put them on an SD card and then put it in the Nintendo Switch, I can do that. But then I also have just the other ones for safekeeping. And of course, there's an added benefit in that I can run my emulators on my computers using that external drive that has all my own games loaded onto it. Okay, so there we go. It took about 5 minutes to transfer everything over. I think we are good to go. So what I want to do now is I want to eject the Disco Elysium cartridge. You'll see that this window will disappear. And that's it. I have now backed up my Disco Elysium cartridge. Let's back up one more game. Let's do Night in the Woods. So this one is a smaller file size, and so it should be a lot faster of a transfer. But it's going to be the exact same process. So I'm going to put the cartridge in upside down. We should see a window pop up that will have the game. And then I'm just going to drag it and drop it over into my downloads folder. Well, it turns out this is actually a pretty big file size. It's about 6.5, almost 7 gigabytes. So about the same actually as Disco Elysium. For some reason, I thought this game was only like 200 megabytes. Either way, this is going to be the same transfer. It's taking about 5.5 minutes. Regardless, there have been some games that I've moved over, things like Dead Cells, and those are very small file sizes. It only takes a couple minutes to move them over. Now, one thing worth noting is I've noticed this a few times now. When I'm transferring over a file, right at the end of it, it will disconnect from the folder itself and then reconnect, and I'll get an error and it'll say there's a problem copying. And so what I think is happening here is as it starts wrapping up the file transfer, there's some sort of glitch happening with the software. Thankfully, Windows gives you an option to just try again to resume the transfer, and every single time it works. And so even though it is a weird glitch, and it did scare me that first time I did it, I haven't had any sort of problems. And so even though I've seen that several times, I haven't actually had any problems actually transferring from one to the other. Okay, so at this point, we've moved over 2 games onto the computer itself. I've moved 1 game over to the SD card, but then I also had it preloaded with a bunch of other games that I had done in my testing. So at this point, I've disconnected the Night in the Woods cartridge as well as the dumper itself, and so I don't need these anymore. Next, I'm going to eject my SD card. We'll come back to the computer and actually use it with emulation here in a moment, but I want to try it on an actual switch first. And so now that this is ejected, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my SD card adapter and then put my micro SD card inside of the MIG Switch cartridge. And admittedly, it is a little bit tight, so you have to get it in the perfect angle and then kind of shove it right in. To be honest, getting it inside of the MIG Flash cart is not that bad, but pulling it out is kind of hard. So you have to really get your finger in here and then just kind of pull it apart. And so I don't plan on doing this very often, but it is one of those things where it's not quite as easy to insert and take out as you would like. Okay, so here's my OLED Nintendo Switch. I've got my account profile already loaded up, and then I've also put it into airplane mode just to be sure. I don't think that putting it in airplane mode is actually necessary because all the games that I have on this micro SD card are just here in these cartridges, and so there's no duplicate gaming happening right now. So now I'm going to take my MIG Switch cartridge, put it inside of the Nintendo Switch, pop it in, and first thing that popped up is Super Mario 3D World. And so this is a game that I took previously from the cartridge and then loaded it up onto the SD card. And then from there, if I press the A button, it should start up the game after I pick up my profile. Now I did get a cloud save error because I'm probably in airplane mode, or maybe I haven't moved over my save file onto this specific switch, but either way I can still start up the software. And there we are, we got Super Mario 3D World running just like it would on any other cartridge. So I'm going to press home to go back, I'm going to press X, close out the game. And now let's switch between different games. This is going to be a little bit tricky to show on screen, but essentially all I'm trying to do here is push that little button, and you can kind of feel when it actually goes down. It takes a little bit of work. And I found the easiest way for me to actually get this to work is to use my fingernail, just right there on that button. So I just pushed it a little bit, and you can see here that Shovel Knight shows up. So I was able to switch between the games. Let me try it one more time. Okay, I feel like I pressed it there, and yep, sure enough, there we go, TMNT. Let's do it one more time. And there we go, Disco Elysium, the one that we had backed up previously. Let's try one more time. And so this one's interesting. I have the Ori collection, and both games show up with this one. And then let's press it one more time, and it should take us back to Super Mario 3D World. There we go. Now, if I press and hold it for a moment, let's see if we can go back to Ori. Yeah, so there we go. I pressed it for maybe 3 seconds, and it went back to Ori instead. If I press it forward, it should go back to Super Mario 3D World. And there we go. So as it stands, this is definitely a lot easier to use than it was previously when I had to eject and then try to put the cartridge back in, but it's still not a perfect system. You can see here that I have 5 different games loaded up, and I have to basically press the button and then remember which order each of these games are in. And you can imagine if I put 100 games onto that SD card, this would get pretty tedious. So I guess here is the way I've been thinking about it. If I am going to put all my Nintendo Switch games onto this one SD card and load them from here, I'm going to treat it more like a random or a shuffle play when I'm playing these games. games. And so instead, I kind of think about this MIG Switch as being a backup tool to be able to use for emulation, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But then if I want to use it with the cartridge, thinking of it more like just a whimsical journey on playing Nintendo Switch. So the idea is if I'm in the mood for Nintendo Switch, I can put in the cartridge, maybe press the button a few times and see what game pops up and then force myself to play it. And I kind of like that idea of being able to push through my back catalog by using the randomness of the MIG Flash cart. So obviously I don't think this is going to be a perfect replacement for just having a bunch of Nintendo Switch cartridges and playing the game that you want. But if you're only going to be focusing on a few games and you don't want to use the cartridge itself, this will work out pretty handily. Hey, quick update. So one of the things I figured out after the fact is that you can manipulate the name of the XCI folder to whatever you want. So essentially when you drag that file off the Switch dumper, you can just change the name to whatever. The Switch is still going to recognize the game. So as you can see here in this example, I've got all my games here saved on my computer, and I've added the names to them to the front. This makes it easier for me to manage which game is which, and my own emulator will also pick up on each of the games too, so I just have to point it to this overall larger folder. The other added benefit is that when you move it over onto your SD card to use with your MIG Flash card, it's actually going to store everything in that order. So what that means is if you put the title at the front of the file name, that means your games will be in alphabetical order. So for example, if you've got 10 games on there and you know that the game you want to play is Super Mario Odyssey, you can then navigate to it a little bit more easily as opposed to just randomly pressing the button and seeing what pops up. And honestly, I think there's merit to both approaches. For example, if you wanted to have a more kind of randomized experience, then just leave them with the numbers and then they will appear when they appear. But you could also make them alphabetical if you wanted to deliberately get to a specific game. And really, there's nothing else stopping you from making it some sort of other order as well. For example, you want to collect all of your Mario games together, then Zelda, things like that, then put those names at the front instead. I still think that having a user interface to be able to navigate through and choose your games is ideal, but again, I don't really think that's possible. And so I'm honestly okay with this and keeping it in alphabetical order. I think it works out pretty well. Now, one thing worth noting when it comes to like DLC, that should be just fine. It should be associated with your Nintendo Switch account. And so you should be able to use that with the cart, no problem. After all, the SD card file that we're using is the exact same thing as the cartridge that we loaded it from. And when it comes to updates, it'll be a very similar process. So if you start up a game and it says, hey, there's a software update, you can run that software update. It's going to save all that data on the Switch itself. Now, the trick is going to be using those updates in DLC when you're doing emulation, because those files are not going to be easily extracted. At that point, you would need a modded Switch to be able to pull that from your Switch. And that's a really kind of advanced topic that obviously requires a modded Switch as well. And so there are some limitations in just using the dumper to pull off the game and then play it on your computer, because the updates in the DLC are not going to carry over. Instead, you would have to extract them from a Nintendo Switch, or at that point, you would have to sail those 7 seas, which we're not talking about in this video. Okay, now let's test out some emulation. So I'm using that tablet PC again. I've propped it up with some masking tape just to give it a little bit of ventilation, just because by running a Nintendo Switch emulator, it is going to tax the CPU a little bit more and I don't want it to overheat. So in this example, we're going to use REUPLOADED, which is a Nintendo Switch emulator that's still in development. You could also use an older version of Yuzu or one of its forks, but we're going to stick with the REUPLOADED this time. Now, the only thing that I've done that's unique here is that I've already added my firmware file, which is going to be the prod.keys file. And so you're going to be on your own to get that either from a modded Switch or, whatever way you find it. And that's a necessary component of using Nintendo Switch emulation. It's essentially a BIOS file at that point. Either way, the only thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into the REUPLOADED settings here, and then I'm going to associate it with the actual game directory of where I put those dumped files. And if you remember, I just put them directly in the downloads folder. So all I'm going to do here is just click on downloads, select the folder, and then hit OK. And sure enough, look at that. I've got Disco Elysium and Night in the Woods. Now, when it comes to the downloads folder, you may remember that we have an XCI folder, not necessarily just the XCI files. If we open this up, you can see there's all those other files and then the rom.xci. And these 4 files are not necessary for emulation. They're only required when it comes to playing on an actual Nintendo Switch. But I like the fact that REUPLOADED is smart enough to be able to know to look inside the XCI folder and then also associate it with the correct game. So let's go ahead and start up one of these games and see if they work. And sure enough, the game is loading up just fine. Now bear in mind, this is going to be the launch version of the game, whatever is hosted on the cartridge itself. So if there have been any sort of updates to the game over time, those software updates are not going to be applied unless you download them and then install them yourself. And there are plenty of Nintendo Switch games that work just fine without any of the latest software updates. In fact, some games just don't have any updates at all. Either way, as you can see, the game is running. I don't have a controller hooked up, but I'm just going to press escape to go out of full screen mode. And you can see that, yes, we are playing Night in the Woods here, emulated for my own Nintendo Switch cartridge, which I just love. I think that's super awesome. I'm going to go into actions and then stop emulation. That should take us back to the main window. Now I want to try the same thing, but with Disco Elysium. And same thing here, double clicking on the file is going to load it up. It might take a moment, but hopefully, all things considered, this should work out fine. And would you look at that? We've got the game loaded and everything seems to be working great. And so, yeah, this is probably one of my favorite things about this whole dumper thing is that I can take my cartridges, put them on my computer, and then immediately emulate them. And I love the idea of being able to emulate my own files, dumping them like this. Now, obviously, there are other ways to get ROM files on the internet, and I'm not trying to downplay that in any way, but I do love the idea of being able to play your own cartridge files. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I love this thing so much. This is the Save the Heroes game dumper. And I made a whole video about this previously. I'll leave it linked down below, but essentially this will allow you to read a bunch of different cartridges and you can pull the game as well as the save file directly from this machine. And this works with Nintendo 64, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and you can also use an attachment to use it with NES. And then down here, you can use it with Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and Game Boy Color. Anyway, one of my bigger revelations of making that video about this cartridge reader is that I took my childhood version of Super Mario 3 and I put it on here and I extracted that game and then I played it myself. And I know it's the exact same file if you were to just grab that ROM on the internet, but there's something different about this, the fact that I'm playing my actual own game from my childhood. And so this is the thing that really draws me to the MIG Flash dumper, is that I'm able to take my own games, put them on a computer for safekeeping, but then also if I want to just emulate that game, I can as well. And of course, as an added bonus, I can also play my backed up games directly on a Nintendo Switch as well. And I'm able to do all of that without using a modded Switch, which is pretty awesome. Now, one other thing worth noting is that the MIG Flash is not the only game on the block. So I have this thing called the Unlock Switch, and they sent this over to me about a month ago. The thing is, the software is not ready on this. So they basically reached out and said, hey, do you want to review this thing? I said, sure, here's my address. So they sent it over to my PO box, but then they said, okay, well, you can't really do anything yet because we don't have any software for it. And so I've actually had a look at this thing, and I think that the build quality is really nice on this and probably better than the MIG Flash. But until I actually know what I'm doing with this thing, I haven't done anything with it. So be on the lookout for a video for this if they do get all that software up and running, and I think it's worth talking about. So let's go ahead and start wrapping up talking about these two components and whether or not I think they're worth it. And this is probably going to be the last video that I make about MIG Flash in general. So I guess here's the way I see it. When we're looking at these two options, I think that the cartridge itself only makes sense in the context of having the dumper as well. Because the easiest way to take advantage of this thing is to use the dumper so that you can grab the files and put them on here, just plug and play. And I think it works really well. The only other way that you could get your Nintendo Switch cartridges dumped to be able to put onto this SD card would be to use a modded Switch. And again, I think that kind of defeats the purpose because with a modded Switch, you can just run games off the SD card. So when it comes down to it, I think the cartridge is pretty neat. I like the idea of being able to have all of my games on here, and I appreciate the fact that they updated with the version 2 that has a button, so it makes it a little bit easier to cycle through the games. In a perfect world, we would have a user interface that would allow me to choose my games on the Switch itself, but I understand why that's not going to work just because this is supposed to mimic an actual cartridge. So when it comes to the cartridge itself, I can see it being worth $60 if all the other things that were required to make it work are worth it for you as well. Now, when it comes to the dumper, I think that this thing is truly worth its weight in gold and well worth the $70 that they're asking for it. For me personally, the ability to be able to take all of that money I've invested in my Nintendo Switch cartridges and then back them up, both on my computer and then also on the cartridge if I want, I think that's just an amazing experience. I also love the fact that there's no real software involved in this at all. We just put in the cartridge and then we just dump it over, just plug and play. So when we're talking about just game preservation and being able to maintain your files and keep them for safekeeping, then I think that this is definitely worth it. When it comes to all the other implications of having a dumper as well as this cartridge thing, sharing files or maybe just grabbing from somebody else, I don't like any of that stuff, and I don't think that's really the purpose of this anyway. And so I do understand that there is room for abuse with something like this, but when it comes to my own use case, when it's just backing up my own game files, I'm really happy with my purchase. So let me know what you think about the dumper as well as the cartridge in the comments down below. Are you interested in backing up your own games like this, or do you think that the cartridges themselves are just fine on their own? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.